From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Florida has become the worst hit state with COVID-19 in the United States. The over 21,000 new cases reported on Saturday made up Florida's highest one-day total since the start of the pandemic. On Sunday, the state broke its previous record for hospitalizations, which it had set more than a year ago. The news came a day after Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, signed an executive order. This prohibited school districts from requiring staff and students to wear masks. But unmasked Floridians and tourists continue to crowd Miami's South Beach and Bayside Marketplace. But in better news, the rate of vaccinations in the United States is rising after weeks of lagging. Texan leaders and citizens marched to their state capital Saturday to protect voting rights. Chanting slogans like "Say no to Jim Crow" and "End the filibuster," they concluded a 4-day march to Austin. This was to protest Republican-led voting laws that are widely believed to be restrictive towards those who do not favor their party. The event was organized by the Poor People's Campaign, Black Voters Matter, and Powered by People. The group marched 27 miles to commemorate the 1965 Voting Rights March led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Alabama. Amongst other restrictions, Texas Senate Bill 1, if passed, would limit early voting hours and ban drive-through and mail-in ballot drop boxes. It would also allow partisan poll watchers to record voters who receive assistance in filling out ballots. In addition, it would make it a crime for local election officials to encourage voting by mail. Texas Governor Greg Abbott and other state Republicans have pushed for what they call election integrity bills since the November 2020 election to curb fraud. This is despite the fact that no evidence of any widespread voter fraud has been found. Critics say these policies are politically motivated as Republicans grapple with a declining voter share due to demographic change. They say that the bills primarily affect and target voters with disabilities and Americans who are not white. Texas has the most restrictive voting processes in the United States. A man who pleaded guilty to vandalizing a Moorhead, Minnesota mosque has been sentenced. Clay County Attorney Brian Milton says 22-year-old Benjamin Enderle was released Friday after serving 95 days. The remainder of Enderle's sentence will be suspended for 5 years. He must also participate in a restorative justice program. Enderle spray-painted hate speech at the Moorhead Fargo Islamic Center. Many Americans who were unable to pay rent were protected from eviction by a federal moratorium. Now they face eviction. Due to widespread job loss, many renters in the United States faced difficulty making their monthly rent payments when the pandemic began in early 2020. The federal government stepped in to prevent people from being evicted. President Joe Biden called upon Congress to pass the moratorium, but it went to recess while the moratorium expired. Representative Cori Bush of Missouri spent sleepless nights on the stairs of Capitol Hill, protesting the return of evictions while calling fellow congresspersons to come back from recess. She's been evicted 3 times and has lived in her car with her 2 children. Bush hopes to persuade Nancy Pelosi to bring the House back into session and act on the issue. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that the Democrats cannot blame the GOP for the end of the eviction moratorium. The Aspen Institute says that over 6 million United States households are currently behind on $20 billion in rental payments. So far, only $3 billion of a $45 billion relief package has been distributed to renters. Experts are now concerned that the end of the rent freeze is likely to increase homelessness in America. A new study has found that the former U.S. President Donald Trump's Muslim ban had a ripple effect on the health of American Muslims. The study by the Yale School of Public Health and partner institutions has been published in the Journal of American Medical Association, or JAMA. A significant number of people in the Muslim community in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area skipped their medical appointments after the ban. There was also an increase in their visits to the emergency department. The study is one of the first to measure the causal impact of how policy changes may affect Muslim Americans, immigrants, and refugee communities. In related news, another study has found that suicide attempts are more common amongst Muslims. Muslim adults in the United States were twice as likely to report a history of suicide attempts compared with individuals from other faith traditions. Results showed that 7.9% of Muslim participants reported a lifetime suicide attempt. This was in contrast to Protestants at 5.1%, Catholics at 6.1%, and 3.6% for Jewish participants. The survey was published in a research letter of JAMA Psychiatry. It was led by Dr. Rania Awad, director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab at Stanford University's School of Medicine. Newly released Chicago crime statistics for the month of July show that shootings increased by 15%. The number of people shot in the city also rose by nearly 10% year over year. There were also 105 homicides in July alone. The Chicago Police Department released the numbers on Sunday morning. Meanwhile, an anti-gun violence group has pledged $25 million to stop shootings. ABC News reports that Everytown for Gun Safety made the pledge. It is the nation's largest gun violence prevention organization. The move is designed to step up and counteract the recent spikes in violent gun crimes. The United Nations says that the Israeli occupation forces have killed 4 Palestinians, including 2 children, in the last 20 days. It has also wounded over 1,000 Palestinians, including 141 children. The report issued Saturday covered the period between July 8th and the 28th. The United Nations Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said that Palestinians were killed and wounded in the occupied West Bank. According to their report, since the start of this year, Israeli occupation forces have killed 50 Palestinians, including 11 children in the occupied West Bank. They've also wounded over 11,000 people. This was around the new illegal Israeli settlement outpost known as Aviator, which is located in the village of Baita in the West Bank city of Nablus. According to the report, out of the 11,232 Palestinians wounded during the reported period, 939 were injured at the boundary of Baita by Israeli occupation forces. These soldiers were guarding the site of the illegal settlement. The settlement was built on Palestinian-owned land, according to the Middle East Eye. In related news, Ismail Hanya has been elected for a second term as the head of Hamas. Hanya has been the group's leader since 2017. He has led Hamas to electoral victory in 2006 when it won the Palestinian parliamentary elections. Burmese military leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, declared himself prime minister of the country on Sunday. He extended military rule to 2023 when he has promised elections. 6 months ago, he dismissed Burma's elected government in a military coup. Aung San Suu Kyi, the main leader of the government, is under arrest and is being tried for corruption. Nearly 1,000 pro-democracy protesters have been killed by the country's security forces. This is the same military commander who led a genocidal campaign against Rohingya Muslims in 2017. Albania repatriated 14 children and 5 women from Syria's Al-Hawal camp on Sunday. This is the largest number of repatriates since the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011. Several Albanians joined different groups fighting against the government troops of Bashar al-Assad, including the Daesh or ISIS. While there's no official data on the dozens of Albanian men killed still fighting or living in the region, the wives and children of many of them have been living for years at the Al Hawal camp. Prime Minister Edi Rama welcomed them at the airport. He also announced that more Albanians are expected to be repatriated soon from the same camp. The New York Times reports that Israel pushed spyware firms to work with Saudi Arabia's government, despite the murder of dissident Jamal Khashoggi. The spyware watchdog initiative, the Pegasus Project, shows that not only Khashoggi, but many members of his entourage were selected for surveillance by Saudi Arabia. His wife, his son Abdullah, a number of friends, and even the Turkish prosecutor in charge of the investigation into his murder were all selected for surveillance. Saudi Arabia's $55 million contract was most likely NSO Group's largest contract. The contract was signed with Saudi Arabia in 2017. At the time, and today as well, it is punishable offense for Israeli citizens to travel to Saudi Arabia without proper authorization. But thanks to the company's contacts at the highest level of the Israeli state, which used it as a tool of diplomacy, it was given the green light. Severe flooding in northeastern Afghanistan has killed at least 113 people. Over 100 were also missing after torrential rains overwhelmed the Khamdais district in Nuristan province. That is about 120 miles northeast of the capital city of Kabul. A rescue operation was underway to find missing people. This year's flooding comes amid fighting between the Afghan government and the Taliban, who have launched multiple offensives across the country. It also comes as Afghanistan is battling a punishing drought and a third wave of COVID-19. The wave has overwhelmed the nation's healthcare sector. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
To get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. The European Union's top court has ruled that employers may forbid the wearing of visible symbols of religious or political belief, such as headscarves. Earlier, Saleha Farouk discussed the issue of Islamophobia in Europe in detail. Let's watch.
Thank you so much. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Malia Bouatia, who is an activist, former president of the National Union of Students, as well as the co-founder of the Students Not Suspects, Educators Not Informants Network. Malia, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, as you might know, one of the top courts of the European Union has recently banned the Muslim headscarf that is worn by many Muslim women. How does this exacerbate perhaps the existing prejudices against Muslim women in Europe?
I think that the ruling effectively formalized what we have known and witnessed, not just as Muslims, but all communities in relation to Muslims and our oppression and repression by the state. We've seen countries mimicking each other's policies under the guise of the so-called war on terror, and through the curtailing of civil liberties, the justifications that keep rolling out are that the Muslims are the problem, are the enemy from within, supposedly. And so this ruling really is just another one on top of a very long pile, whilst the fact that it's representative of the continent serves a particular blow, particularly to Muslim women, and reinforces their the institutionalized oppression and racism that they experience daily within their lives across this side of the world. I think that it's somewhat unsurprising, because we've seen the ban enforced in so many individual countries in some way, shape, or form.
Now, the reason of so-called neutrality has previously been used to justify similar public sector bans, and this extends that logic now to the private sector. How is this logic flawed, in your opinion?
The logic is flawed only if you assume that those introducing these particular policies, these rulings, have the goodness of the people in mind. I think that we shouldn't be cynical about those that lead our countries, those that sit in the highest of institutions, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere around the world. And I think that in reality, Islamophobia serves a purpose. It serves a political agenda. It allows, the attacks on civil liberties. It allows more control, more attacks on political opposition and dissent within these nations that are supposedly, particularly, in Europe, portray themselves as the bastions of free speech, of democracy, and of defending human rights. And actually, what we've seen is that Islamophobia has served the purpose of rolling back on all the gains that so many millions throughout history have fought for, freedoms that that some sections of society, particularly in the West, had taken for granted for far too long.
Thank you so much for that insight. Now, many in the world might consider this as a time in Europe, a time of high Islamophobia, racism, and hatred, as you describe. So as this ruling came out of the European courts, have lawmakers disregarded this sensitive time in the country, or the many countries of Europe?
From the beginning of the pandemic, particularly in Europe, in the UK, for example, it was even the case here in the Netherlands, we saw, racism rise considerably, a lot of blame placed on Muslims and others, and a very particular demonization campaign. In the UK, for example, far-right groups and figures had taken it upon themselves to share old videos of Jumu'ah prayers, for example, in some of the major mosques in London, and in order to spread fear and claim that this was happening during the lockdown, during the national restrictions that had been enforced due to the pandemic. And it turns out that one particular mosque, for example, had been closed since February, long before the lockdown was even enforced, long before COVID had become such a national and even international crisis. And so, particularly in times of heightened anxiety, of hysteria, people will revert to racism, scapegoating the Muslim communities. It's almost like we've become the easy target, the easy excuse for everything that's happening that is uncontrollable and inexplicable. And I think that governments are not unaware of that. Even here in the Netherlands, at some point, it had the highest deaths in the region, the highest rate of infections. It was really, it reached an alarming point, so much so that before the winter holidays, it was one of the first countries to have to reintroduce the lockdown measures. And yet, amidst all of that mayhem, the government found the time and the resources to implement policies in order to police mosques, to police their particular funding streams, to restrict their political opposition, and to control them under the guise of Dutch values, whatever that means. And so we've seen that despite the crisis, despite the tragedy, despite the the horrifying period that has been this pandemic, racism, unfortunately, has not been dismissed, has not been set aside by our governments, by our policymakers, in order to kind of prioritize the more important public health crisis that everything should have been invested in.
Now, interestingly, the European courts are leaving this decision of religious freedom up to individual employers, companies, and businesses, allowing them to make the decision to perhaps stop employees from exhibiting religious symbols. Could you talk to us about the implications of this and go further into how this might disproportionately impact Muslim women in the workforce in Europe?
I don't think that, again, I don't think that we should be naive about what these institutions are doing, and how they think this will trickle down. These individual companies, businesses, whatever workplaces are not separate from wider society. And if we look at everything that's happening, particularly the policies, the practices, the campaigns that are being waged by governments across Europe, it is one of heightened Islamophobia. And so this law only facilitates an institutionalized form of Islamophobia even further. And in reality, it just gives the green light. It gives the green light to those in positions of power to be able to not only practice racism, get away with it, and be perfectly in their rights to do so, not unlike the governments across Europe at the moment. So I think that we cannot see it as disconnected. We have to understand that this will have a disproportionate impact on Muslims. What's worse is, because it's in the private sector, the protection of these individuals is likely to be less so, depending on the particular area of work. It means that the expectations placed upon these spaces in terms of equality and diversity are again left at the discretion of the employers. And I think that this is just a contradictory implementation of the so-called freedom of speech that Western leaders have been preaching, in which they restrict the freedom of expression, freedom of speech of Muslims, of political opponents, by forcing them to remove their hijabs, or to not visibly or politically express or religiously express their views, whilst at the same time saying that can say that they're championing it by giving employers, giving these businesses and companies free rein to do what they will.
Now, when it comes to this ruling, do you believe that it is set in stone? Are appeals at all possible? And what can human rights advocates and activists such as yourself either planning to do, or what can they do to help counter this unfair ruling?
Nothing should be understood as set in stone. I think that there is always potential for resistance, not just potential, but the necessity for it. And I think that this is, whilst some may take it as just a more symbolic expression of racism by the European Court, I think that we should also take it as, we can also read it as a symbolic cry to take action, to mobilize against Islamophobia, to work with trade unions, to work with teachers, students, any and every section of society, to not only approve the particular policies or rulings, but also to ensure that these views are, pulled out by their roots, that we as a society can oppose them as and when they're introduced or voted through from the very top. And I think that in most of our countries, most countries across the West, there are organizations working against Islamophobia, often with little resources and support, and certainly not people on the ground. And this is what we have to think about. How can we act locally to impact the rise of Islamophobia internationally? I also think that there has been a lot of concerted efforts to kind of bridge struggles, to work, to work across borders. And the fact that this ruling has come from the European Court should encourage us to work across the continent in particular, to reverse that, to not only reverse that decision, but to build sustainable, long-term anti-racist networks.
Speaking here today with Malia Bouatia, who is an activist and former president of the National Union of Students, as well as co-founder of the Students Not Suspects, Educators Not Informants Network. Malia, thank you so much for your insightful and your valuable participation with us today.
Thank you.
Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha and Malia. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the events happening in South Asia related to the Afghan peace process, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. Taliban were recently in China meeting with the Chinese foreign ministers. While they were just done with their conversation, Secretary of State from the United States flew to India talking with their foreign minister. All about Afghanistan. But where is Pakistan in all of this? Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan, giving an interview to PBS, says that America has messed up. To discuss with us is a scholar from Pakistan, Professor Junaid Ahmed. He is director for the Center of Global Dialogue in Lahore, Pakistan, and is with the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Assalamu alaikum, Imam. It's wonderful to be here.
Wa alaikum salam. So what's your assessment of current situation in Afghanistan?
Well, my assessment is probably very similar to the Prime Minister Imran Khan's, which is a very straightforward one, which is the situation now is somewhat unpredictable, although we see obviously over the past few months the signs of the ascendancy of the Taliban taking over district after district after district, so that roughly about half the country, if not more, is now under Taliban control. But the larger assessment is one that, of course, was articulated not just by Prime Minister Imran Khan very candidly, as you said, perhaps rubbing it in the face, but I don't think that was the intention. I think the intention right now is to give an overall assessment, not just of what's happening right now, but also how we got here. And I think that that is a view shared by, of course, many analysts who understand what's been going on, who understand Afghanistan, and particularly since the U.S. NATO invasion in November 2001. And that is that there was never going to be a military solution to this. Whether the aims and objectives were noble or not noble, regardless of that, a military solution at its peak, and we should remember there were close to 150,000 U.S. NATO forces. Now that couldn't do the trick, and I don't think anything would have done the trick. And so this is the point that Prime Minister Imran Khan was trying to emphasize, because he's constantly asked, and the one thing that he, as opposed to so many other politicians certainly in Pakistan, is that he's been very consistent about this, to the chagrin of many, even within the Pakistani establishment and the political class, that this war on terror was always going to lead to more and more complications, to more violence in the region, and its spillover effects within Pakistan. And I think that assessment has proven to be true. And I think that the United States, sadly, after spending trillions of dollars, untold casualties, has realized that now, and this is why you see this very awkward type of, I say awkward because it's without any significant planning, understanding with even the Afghan government that that is its ally and that it supports. It has kind of picked up its bags and running, and slowly the withdrawal will be complete, not having an understanding of kind of what will ensue, and giving these kind of schizophrenic responses that, on the one hand, you mentioned Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in India, on the one hand saying that it's a positive sign that these Taliban forces are being engaged and being considered as a significant political force. On the other hand, also saying that, well, if they come to power, it will be a pariah state. And obviously, at the same time, we also know that the U.S. continues to conduct airstrikes within Afghanistan. So this type of schizophrenic response to the developments right now is an outcome, I think, of the incredibly confused and detrimental overall policy that the U.S. has engaged in Afghanistan since 2001.
Afghan government seems to still expect Pakistan to do for Afghanistan what America has failed to do. What type of leverage Pakistan has on Taliban?
Yes, I think that this is the biggest misconception, certainly propagated by, in the past. In the past, it was a very, almost very offensive, very insulting, accusatory tone. For most of the so-called war on terror since 2001 against Pakistan, that in fact it was not the U.S. NATO occupation, it was not the arrogance of that occupation, it was not the corruption and incompetence of this government in Kabul, of the former Northern Alliance members. It was none of that, and how the population was feeling so incredibly disenfranchised, marginalized, and insulted and humiliated by many night raids and so on, drone attacks, air strikes. But it was simply Pakistan's harboring and sheltering of a variety of kind of Taliban outfits, the Haqqani network. That was the cause of why this U.S. NATO occupation was failing miserably in Afghanistan. And I think that most serious observers, not those with with some type of ideological and propagandistic agenda, most serious observers will understand that that's ridiculous. That in fact, one can argue that, of course, in the 1990s, there was the Taliban force, which were Taliban. Our listeners and viewers should know. These are students. These were students, many of them orphan children that had come across the border and studied in the madrasas in Pakistan. So it's a band of students that had come in Afghanistan in the first place. And at that point, not to say that everyone agreed with the Taliban's ideological perspective, but we have to understand, and this is what we forget, that this is a country that has now been in no less than 4 decades of non-stop war. First under the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, following that the intra-Mujahideen conflict and violence that ensued. After that, the Taliban versus the Northern Alliance. And then, of course, after 2001, the US NATO occupation. So this is a war-ravaged society for many, many decades. And at that point, yes, certainly in the 1990s, Pakistan was very clearly supporting the Taliban. And at the same time, it should be remembered that at that point, from 94 through 96, the period in which the warlords in Kabul engaged in mass killings, mass rapes, what Human Rights Watch called the worst period in Afghan history, 94 to 96. At that point, the Taliban were welcomed in the sense that they would bring about some type of law and order in this very violent society. At this stage, it is directly attributable, and I think this is an important point, that we often think of the Taliban as being this kind of ideological movement of kind of some very extremist interpretation of religion and that sort of thing. I think that this misses the point entirely. What ensued in terms of the resistance in Afghanistan starting 2002, 2003 was not simply this ideological movement. In fact, what the Taliban has been for many, many years, I think a much more accurate description would be the ethnic Pashtun resistance to foreign occupation, which has now, of course, I mean, over the years, has not been just the Pashtun population. It has incorporated many of the other ethnic groups within Afghanistan as well. So I think that this is not very useful in understanding what has unfolded, to just call it this kind of extreme ideological position of a group.
So you mentioned that they have incorporated non-Pashtun groups. So that seems like a development. How are they able to do that?
Well, one of the ways is of course what we see now. What we started off the conversation with this visit to Beijing. Well, actually, the actual city of Xinjiang, but it is part of the larger political and diplomatic offensive that the Taliban have been engaged in now for many, many years. We just know about the Doha diplomatic type of meetings that have been going on for many, many years, and in some ways which have resulted in nothing much. So the Taliban, as well as, by the way, the Afghan government, have understood that actually doing outreach to many of those countries that, of course, have been supportive of the enemies of the Taliban, the various warlords in the Northern Alliance, whether it be in Iran, which is, of course, always had close relations with the Hazara Shia in Afghanistan, whether it's in Moscow, where they had also gone, and now, of course, in Beijing. One of the things that the Taliban have tried to convey is that this is not going to be, or at least they don't want this to be, kind of a war till the end in which they just take over the country. That, in fact, they want to engage in something very different, which will be not of novelty for them, an inclusive type of setup, a political settlement, and so on. The problem is, of course, the intra-power play within Afghanistan is so delicate right now within the Ashraf Ghani government, President Ashraf Ghani, who still is just complaining about the U.S. leaving and is dead set against any kind of settlement with the Taliban. So I think that for a while now, that the Taliban have not only been engaged in this diplomatic offensive outside, but internally, getting people from the Hazara, getting people from the Tajik, Uzbek people, telling them that, look, this is going to be we want this to be a different situation in which all of these other ethnic groups are also included. And now they do have commanders from the different ethnic groups.
How Taliban are able to make major victory moves despite very large Afghan army, which is better supplied and better equipped, it seems, and better trained, at least when you look at Afghan army, they seems like soldiers on the street of Chicago during the Black Lives Matter, well equipped, all loaded up. And you see Taliban, they're still going around with shalwar kameez. So how Taliban are able to defeat Afghan army, which is trained for so long, in 20 years?
Well, Imam, this has been the story in I think of the entire Afghan venture, in the sense that what to many people will strike as just remarkable, unbelievable. For those of us who understand this type of guerrilla insurgency warfare, it's very non-conventional, and you're absolutely right. These individuals from the mountains and their shalwar kameez and their chappals and their just sandals and so on, how they have been able to sustain this resistance against obviously a government supported by the most powerful military forces in the world. And I think that it's a fundamental mistake to kind of understand it in this kind of conventional military technological warfare, and to understand the Taliban as in the history of all forms of kind of guerrilla warfare against some type of occupying power. Same thing you can say not only in Iraq, but the history is a long history from Vietnam and so on. So I think that has been the mistake. It's a mistake to think that the Taliban were just going to stand there and confront directly American military, the Afghan military supported by the American military. It has always been this type of a guerrilla insurgency, and I think that this is what has been the failure to understand, that how to confront this type of an insurgency, rather than seeing that it's not a conventional military, and or that that's how we're going to subdue it, and that hasn't worked. And I think that right now, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Taliban still have, in terms of the ideology of resistance, and that is very popular amongst people who are so dissatisfied by the government and by the foreign occupation of these now 2 decades. The Taliban, the Afghan security forces, just like in Iraq, the late Robert Fisk and of course Patrick Coburn has spoken about these ghost units of the military, in which they're just trying to earn a paycheck. They never really believed in anything, and so when the Taliban is coming with some type of fervor in its military battles, the Afghan security forces, just like many in the Iraqi security units, they don't fight. So this is also what's going on in Afghanistan.
So tell me this, Pakistan had a major problem with Pakistani Taliban. If Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban, do you expect Pakistani Taliban to rise again and Pakistan goes through the same nightmare which it went through?
No, I don't. And I think that this is what Prime Minister Imran Khan and others, of course, as well, who understand this, keep on emphasizing, that only by continuing some type of outside military approach to this internal conflict within Afghanistan, any type of outside interference, which of course now this is the whole thrust of the Chinese welcoming the Taliban and just recognizing them as a significant political player, not recognizing them as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. It is and emphasizing that this is ultimately, they can facilitate some type of intra-peace agreement, but they're not going to interfere. I think this is the lesson that they're trying to teach, and hoping that the United States and other countries learn as well. It cannot be imposed from outside. When you attempt to do that, you then have the result, which of course Pakistan will feel the most because it's a neighboring country, and that was the spillover effect of Afghanistan into Pakistan, and you saw this period of spate of suicide bombings, etc., and people claiming to be the new Pakistani Taliban, which we must remember, many of their horrendous actions, the Afghan Taliban distanced themselves from. They condemned many of those actions. For example, the Peshawar bombing of the school bombing of the school children. The Afghan Taliban denounced that. So it's also important to remember, these are not the same. These are not the same, and I think we make a mistake when we do that.
So if these are not the same Taliban as 25 years ago, what has changed? Are they going to come again and block women education and kick girls out of school?
Well, look, I mean, this is right now speculation. This is also, in some ways, taking the Taliban on their word right now and seeing whether they actually mean it. So, of course, they have put out many statements. They wrote a very famous piece for the New York Times, in which they said that, look, particularly on these points that we are very justifiably concerned, for example, female education, other domestic kind of policy that they would have on a whole front of other issues. they have made it very clear there, and even we see right now the districts they're taking over. One of the things they're doing is these schools, they're not closing down schools, both for boys and females. They're just putting a new headmaster there, a principal, and so on. So this is up for speculation. But the one thing that we do know is that this new what the British intelligence, the neo-Taliban, what they call, certainly for pragmatic realpolitik, if they have any chance of being part of some type of political settlement in which they are a stakeholder in the new Afghan political setup, they will have to make a lot of pragmatic concessions on a number of things on which they were previously justifiably criticized for. I think that this is going to be the real impetus for them to evolve and accept many different changes from what they used to implement in the past.
Share this with me, please, that Pakistan and India has competed over Afghanistan to influence in many ways. Sometime the government, even before 40-year war, sometime it will be favorable, sometime in oppose and all that. Now that Taliban are flying all over Doha and Russia and Qatar and Turkey and all of that, does Pakistan have any leverage or relationship to counterbalance Indian interest and investment in Afghanistan?
Oh, I think that right now more than ever. I mean, again, going back to this constant mantra about Pakistan, the Taliban and this resistance in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades being directly the result of some type of Pakistani support. I think that's a bogus claim. I think at maximum, certainly one can concede that many of these fighters would go across the border. But of course, we must remember this is not an easily controllable border. It has always been a porous border. We must remember that about two-thirds of the global of the Pashtun population, which is on both sides of the border, are in Afghanistan. Are in Pakistan. 1/3 of them are in Afghanistan. So this has always been a porous border, tribal, family connections on both sides. So Pakistan has obviously always had some relationship with this, going back many obviously years and decades, with the Taliban and the ethnic Pashtun resistance within Afghanistan. And it is precisely that kind of goodwill that they've had that brought the Taliban to the table in the first place, in Doha particularly, the Doha negotiations with the United States, the attempt to also bring the Afghan government, which has been resistant to that. So they have that, and this is what the Prime Minister has articulated, Imran Khan has articulated, that it is precisely the Pakistanis' attempt to bring them to the negotiating table. But they also, the point to remember that he emphasized, that this would have worked out much better had it been when the U.S. NATO occupying troops were nearing about 150,000 in Afghanistan. Now that they are withdrawing and the Taliban clearly are on the ascendancy, it's very difficult, whether it's the Taliban or any type of military and political force, to get them to the negotiating table when they're winning anyways. So it is going to still be, I mean, I agree with you that it's going to still be the Pakistani goodwill and friendly pressure that will still try to bring Taliban to some type of a political solution, with clearly an Afghan government which is collapsing day by day.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Junaid Ahmed.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes or more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.